Quick announcement before we get started with the show. Here at Data Skeptic HQ, we're looking to hire an experienced sales engineer. Remote applicants are perfectly fine. We need someone who can help work with us to bring an AI-driven automation solution to medium and large enterprise customers. If you or someone you know might be a good fit, please head over to dataskeptic.com/careers, where you'll see our most recent listing. I'd love to tell you more about it, but I don't want to waste the listeners' time. Dataskeptic.com/careers and check it out. Today, Data Skeptic is not sponsored by a VPN. Hey, that might come. These are becoming more popular. From what I understand, the market's growing. With stay-at-home orders in place, or even just being good policy, even if it's not the law, there are many people trying to protect their home internet traffic, and for very good reason. At least in the US, our ISPs are basically allowed to spy on us. It's kind of crazy. Look into a VPN just to have one. But that alone isn't the only thing you need to worry about when it comes to privacy. Privacy is one of those issues that comes up at many levels. And while I'm definitely interested in topics like differential privacy, my personal opinion has always been that most of privacy is really a human-computer interaction issue. I remember being in an office once when much stricter policies were put in place for what your password had to be. So strict, in fact, that most people had trouble remembering them, and the frequency of post-it notes with passwords on the side of monitors, that became a much more common occurrence at that office. Privacy, I think, is a problem that has to be engineered and designed quite well. This week on the show, I speak with Moses Namara. He's a PhD student at the HATLab, the Human and Technology Laboratory at Clemens University. We have an interesting and broad discussion about privacy implications and the overlap with HCI and things along those lines.
My name is Moses Namara. I am a PhD candidate at Clemson University doing work on online privacy, basically investigating people's experiences and expectations of online privacy. I am originally from Uganda. I was born in Kampala and came to the US for college, and now I'm on my way to getting that PhD.
And when it comes to online privacy, can you be a bit more specific? Are you concerned with things at like the SSL level or a user's relationship to their browsers, or where do your interests lie?
My interests lie at the user's perspective. So I'm coming in not at the technical aspect of privacy, but at the user experience aspect of privacy. And so the key question being, how do we help users manage their privacy online as most of our lives transition to the use of online technologies?
Yeah, in particular, has the, COVID-19 and the stay-at-home orders and all these sorts of things, how has that affected the privacy world?
It has affected the privacy in terms of most people now being forced to interact or connect through various forms of technology, really. And this varies from students having to download and use online technologies to stay in touch with their teachers, to parents or adults having to download social media in terms of keeping up with the news, but also making sure that they can connect with other people that normally they would have met face-to-face or physically. So in terms of how that has affected privacy is that we're seeing a lot of people now adopt new technologies they haven't used or use more of the technologies at a higher rate than they would normally do. And so that definitely, depending on what technology they end up using, presents different privacy issues and challenges.
And is privacy, I don't know the truth to this, I'm not an immunologist, but people say, well, if every human being stayed home for 2 weeks, the virus would be effectively defeated, even though that's kind of impossible. If everyone used two-factor authentication and some simple protocols, would that solve privacy?
That would definitely help in terms of protecting people's access to their online accounts, or online logins, or online places that they need to log into, right? But that's at a security level in terms of offering people the option to actually securely log into their accounts and making sure actually the persons who are trying to request or log into their account. So that helps secure their data in one aspect. The other aspect in terms of privacy is that we basically are looking at their data that they explicitly maybe give to the technology. We're also looking at the data that the technology that they are using requires for it to properly function. We're also looking at the data that is not explicitly given by the user, but implicitly inferred by the technology, right? Based on different maybe algorithms that they use. And so we're looking at all these different aspects in terms of how does users' data come into play, and how do we ensure that that access is restricted to only people who the user is comfortable sharing with or having people access it.
This is a really interesting comparison you guys have in the paper that we'll talk, I'm sure, a lot about. Privacy at a glance, the user-centric design of glanceable data exposure visualizations. There's a lot I want to unpack there, but maybe to start with, could you expand on the difference there between, privacy in terms of settings and privacy of data? What's the user giving up in each case, I guess?
So privacy in terms of settings are basically the controls that guide or enable users to set or let be known what level of privacy they're comfortable with. And this is usually enabled by the technologies that they're using. So these technologies, like a social media company or site like Facebook, has controls that enable people to set who they want to share with. Is it their friends? Is it public? So that setting that level. And so those controls help in that way. Then we have privacy in terms of the data. So the data is basically any use of user information beyond what the primary purpose was. And so I think that's where the issue comes in terms of using this data in other secondary ways, deviant of the primary ways that someone had intended for it to be used. That's what I like to think about when I think about user data.
Yeah, when I'm installing an app, I'm often being asked, do you give it permissions for your camera or this or that? And often it'll say, access to contact the internet, which is such a weird Pandora's box to me. Is it a weather app that's going to talk to the weather server and get the weather from my zip code? Or is it an app that's going to, copy all of my private data and send it to the mothership? I've never felt like I really had I could maybe turn that on or off, but I never had a full control setting. Is that something you envision that maybe users would get more control of? Or do we trust that the user can manage those controls? Maybe it could get too complicated. I don't know. What do you think?
So it's actually good that you raised that, because my research looks at what is the comfortable level at which users are able to actually engage and use these controls. But first of all, the more controls you have, the more less likely people are to use all those controls, because they're just a huge number of them. And so that requires like cognitive efforts to actually purposefully seek out these controls and use them appropriately. But at the same time, we need such controls in place, because then users are able to explicitly kind of make their intention known or set a level of privacy they're comfortable with. Now, the trick becomes, or the paradox becomes, we have these controls in place, but we have few people using them, right? And so it becomes a question of how do we meet the user's needs where they are, and how do we ensure that they are motivated enough to actually, first of all, understand what these controls do and be able to actually go ahead and use them comfortably.
So in some sense, the existence of settings sort of puts it off on the user. Hey, go and set these the way you're expecting and then just hope for the best, I guess, after that. Although the paper is really interesting to me, and I don't know if these are new ideas. I certainly hadn't seen this before, but giving users some visualizations that tell them more in real time about the way in which their apps are consuming and what they're sending and that sort of thing. Could you describe a little bit from a user experience perspective what you guys were experimenting with?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to shout out to the main author of this paper, who was my colleague called Darisha Wilkinson. She's the one who this idea stemmed from, and I was just lucky to be a part of the project. But the idea was basically to make or bring to the forefront visualizations that could help. They could understand what data that the apps they had installed on their phones were accessing, right? And so the hope was that these visualizations could offer more understanding and maybe be a motivator enough for people to actually maybe go in one or another and control how this data is being accessed.
In terms of the data, I mean, is there any cognitive load on the user for keeping track of that? Like what data is going where? Maybe if I'm a researcher, a security professional, I want to study the various ways that the app's connecting, but maybe some of that's mundane. It connects to Google Analytics, which connects to stuff like that. That's sort of explainable. How much time do we expect the average user to be spending learning about stuff like this?
The hope was that we'd put this on a screensaver, and so premise being that it doesn't take for you too long to stare at your screensaver, because that's the first screen that you'd actually see if you're to unlock your phone. But also we're looking at the different ways that maybe would be more understandable. Would it be enough if we just showed the app itself and the notification in terms of saying, hey, we have Instagram here and it looks to have access to your location 6 times in the last 2 hours, right? The other premise we're looking at is that, okay, if we take away the whatever app it is, because there are many apps that probably access location, and just give you location and say, your location has been accessed 6 times in the last 2 hours. And so which of those different ways of viewing what information is being accessed would motivate people to actually go ahead and make changes to their privacy settings or be concerned enough about the different information that is being accessed off of their phone.
The world we happen to live in, and I guess the technology doesn't require it to be this way, but we have this middleman, right? We have the App Store, where same thing on iPhone, where you have the App Store, or I'm an Android person, I can go to Google Play, and any developer can put their app there. I guess there's some sort of screening process, and then I can download it, install it, and there's reviews. So if it looks bad, maybe people will share that, and I won't try it or something. But there's Google or there's Apple in the middle there. How much responsibility do entities like that have at keeping their store clean, so to speak?
It's a huge responsibility that I hope they take seriously, because the App Store is not only serving people who care about their privacy like me, but also serving others who may not know the intricacies of what it actually means to be private. And so the onus then becomes on the gatekeeper himself to make sure that the apps they have on the store are privacy compliant and are not nefarious applications that are going to end up violating people's privacy, because they have a lot to lose anyway. So if the App Store becomes a place where people cannot trust to go and find secure applications, then that App Store is going to end up not seeing as many developers develop for it, but also not see many end users end up using their applications. So I think there's a lot of interest. There's enough skin in the game for these App Stores to be secure and protect the privacy for users.
I'd love to go back a little bit to the user survey we were discussing. I didn't get around yet to asking you about some of the conclusions. What were some of the insightful things you learned from the real-world user data and feedback you got?
The one key takeaway from that study is that users' preferences for whether the visualization be app-centric or data-centric depends on their value system. If they value the relations, then they are more, in terms of the relationship they have with the application, then they are more likely to prefer the app-centric visualization. In terms of if they value the content, which is basically the type of data that these applications are accessing, then the data-centric version was more appealing to them. So it depended on what the user put more value or valued most about their privacy.
And maybe we could talk a little bit about VPNs. To begin with, tell us a little bit about some of your interests and research in the area.
My interest in the area stems from, first of all, my own experience using a VPN. And the first time I used a VPN, it wasn't for privacy per se, but it was more of a way of accessing content behind a firewall or behind a censored wall. And the reason I became interested in particularly understanding or examining VPNs was because, first of all, where I come from in Uganda, what happened was that they put a tax on accessing social media sites and generally the internet. And so what happened is that we ended up seeing a lot of people use VPNs, right, as a way of bypassing those restrictions. The other motivator was Congress rolling back privacy protections, which would have required ISPs to ask for user consent before they could share their information with third parties. And so those two combined kind of drove my interest in studying how people actually end up using privacy enhancing technologies, especially VPNs. And so in this case, I was looking for people who actually use VPNs as a tool that protects their privacy.
And what is, I don't know if you had a chance to look too much into this, but the penetration rate, I feel like many people are aware of VPNs, although perhaps that's my own bias, right? I tend to know more technologically savvy people, but I can't say that even amongst those people, everyone uses one. What is the, I guess, general penetration, or how well do we understand that, of deployment of this technology?
So general deployment, I would say we have around 30% of internet users in Latin America using VPNs for primarily just to access censored content. When we look at North America and Europe, we have it's a little bit on the lower side, around 18% of users. And mainly, majority of these are people who are using it for, accessing their institutions or accessing their employers' networks. So they're using it as a tool to basically securely conduct those activities or do that. But when we look at people who actually are using it for privacy purposes, that number is a little bit very, very low. Actually, most people who use that are actually found in the States, interestingly.
Why do you suppose that is?
I guess we're a little bit more aware of what online privacy means to us. If you look at the case of Europe, where they have the GDPR, strong laws on online protections, this all creates an awareness among the end users to take seriously the notion of safeguarding their privacy online.
And where do you think we should be in terms of rollout? Are there people who maybe inadvertently are having things they would like to be held private, protected? I mean, I guess, if somebody looks at what movies, I don't think anyone can find out what movies I watch, but that's at worst embarrassing, right? Then there's my healthcare data, which I don't want out, or maybe I'm like an activist or something. There's a long range here of those who most need the protection, I guess. How many do you think understand and can deploy VPNs?
Yeah, you actually raise a very important point whereby most people say they have nothing to hide, so they could care less what happens to their data. But I tend to argue that if we are making protections for one group of people, then I think they should all extend to all of us, because even the people who make that argument have things that they deem at least private. And the clearest way of kind of making that more clear is that I don't think they necessarily allow anyone to enter their house or their bedroom in that case, right? But that's a physical notion of privacy. And so similarly, what happens online is basically a mirror of what happens in our offline lives. And so whereas generally we may not have a problem in terms of, what we share or caring about what we share, I think there are some expectations, whether mundane or clear cut, that we want some form of boundary in terms of how we regulate our relationships online or regulate who uses our data online.
Yeah, I find myself, even though I mentioned who cares about my movies, I should probably hold a stronger perspective of the opposite almost, that it should be privacy by default because we need a sort of a herd immunity. Maybe for someone what they watch is consequential in a way I can't anticipate. But I would guess we all agree our health data needs to be private on some level, yet paradoxically shareable, right? I want my doctors to be able to collaborate, maybe even a researcher to know about me in some general anonymous way. Do you have any thoughts on how we can maintain the right levels of privacy but still deliver on some of these other needs?
I think a lot of that comes down to control and transparency. So as you rightly put it, yes, we want our health data to be private and probably transferable or portable to other doctors, and to an extent for researchers to figure out new remedies from our data. But we don't want that to be done behind our backs, right? I think we want some clarity in terms of what data exactly is being shared, have a final say in terms of how that gets used or how that gets transferred, right? And so it will be unfair or not right for you to go to your doctor for an alignment and the next day you maybe do a travel to some far-flung country without your knowledge immediately that doctor having access to your health records. And so I think what you would expect is you'd already have some kind of consent that you would have given that you're okay with that action or that transfer happening. And so unfortunately, that's not how usually these technologies work behind the scenes, because it just breaks when we try to offer people consent at scale, right? And so usually then the default becomes automatically doing it or not seeking consent from users just because of the complexities that may be involved.
And I'd love to get into a little bit of your work on how these effects work cross-culturally. So I recently heard Dr. Fauci saying some things about we're aware that there is an anti-vaccination movement out there, even though it's not scientifically founded. We need to start educating people for when the COVID-19 vaccine arrives. So there's a public health initiative he wants to take to churches and community groups and get to the people through these alternative channels. I'm wondering if you see analogies for how we educate people about privacy.
Definitely. So first of all, different people, different notions of privacy, different ways of living, different cultures that dictate even our privacy in our own private lives. And so that is true that we're going to have different ways we think about privacy. And so a one-size-fits-all cannot necessarily apply to everyone. To use your analogy in terms of reaching out to people who are anti-vacciners, you need to emphasize, or for these groups of people, you need to emphasize the benefit that they derive from, in this case, using a vaccine, right? And so that's what you need to focus on, because you'll be surprised. Usually the benefits are not as apparent as we hope or think they are. And people then drive on more of the side effects. In this case, we're talking about vaccines to kind of reinforce within this group of people, reinforce their ideas or their thoughts or their philosophies in terms of why vaccines are bad. And people who resonate highly with that message then tend to follow it very religiously. So when I bring that back to privacy, the difference we see is usually there's individual differences, and most of the notions of privacy tend to focus on the individual. But in other cases, there are going to be group differences. And so those group differences will adhere to different privacy privacy notions or ways of dealing with privacy in that setting itself. And so I think what I found in my study is we tend to actually focus less on such groupings or such cultures. They're really understudied. And the quicker we do it, the more we try to understand where they're coming from, their behaviors, their expectations, their attitudes towards privacy, then the better suited we are to be in a position to design for them technologies that they can comfortably use.
I'm curious if you think that we'll eventually have automated solutions for these, or I guess to what degree we need a human in the loop. I could see where maybe my phone learns that I'm an Instagram influencer and everywhere I go I take 30 pictures and take for granted that I give my generous permissions to Instagram app because it's learned about me and my real preferences and can maybe make some privacy inferences on my behalf. Yet I'm also a little intimidated of something that makes too many inferences on my behalf. Is there a happy medium somewhere in here?
I definitely agree with you in terms of if we're headed to a degree of automation where most of these decisions are taken care of on our behalf, or we still need the human in the loop. And so what is that sweet spot? I have no right answer right at the moment, but I think more work needs to be done in terms of trying to find that sweet spot and to strike a balance, because what I find initially in some of my studies is that people are comfortable automating some of the mundane tasks, right? And so to go back to example, if you're an influencer and we know that you're taking 30 pictures every time maybe you step out, and you're comfortable of that action being automated, then you'll have no fightbacks or any worries about that being updated on your behalf, as long as it's done correctly and it's as done as accurately as possible. But the key there is that is a very simple task, right? And it doesn't have consequences to it. So taking pictures, that there's no really big consequence or fallback if you get it wrong. But if we look at an action like that really has real life consequences, let's say, for example, we learned that you take pictures and they turn out to be the wrong pictures that finally get maybe in the public domain that you didn't want them to be shared in. And there's a real life consequence of like you losing your job. If you're a famous person and losing your credibility in public, then you would want to have human control of that action rather than it being automated. So I think it depends on the action, and also it depends on the consequence of that action.
And there's, in my opinion, been a rapid growth in a lot of this technology. I mean, 20 years ago, well, maybe there were cookies 20 years ago, but 25, 30 years ago, there was a day when there weren't cookie files. And even those files today, I'm not quite sure if everyone really gets what they are or the degree to which they're a privacy threat. Do we have a system that's just inherently too complex, that there's a mental load on people to learn all these detailed things to even understand what's being exposed?
Yes, definitely. We have reached a point where there's a lot of mental demand or mental load on users that tax users. First of all, it affects their cognition, but it also affects the way they make decisions about some of these technologies. You can only think about it in terms of how many technologies you really interact with on a typical day. Definitely, I think more than one. And so if you were to intrinsically make a decision for each and every one of those, then as the number goes up, as an app for everything becomes more dominant or more common, then that cognition load tends to increase over time. And so that's why we propose some solutions like, hey, how maybe automating some of these actions could make it easier, or maybe for this action is too severe that we want to keep you in the loop. And so thinking about those types of questions and trying to find the right balance for what the right balance is, I think is important at this point in our technological journey that we continue to ride forward.
I'm curious if you have any wisdom from a perspective of like interface design. I remember, for a long time, dialogues would ask you a question and say yes or no. And at some point, people got smarter and said, well, put the actual action on the button. It should say save or not save, so there's no confusion. Do you have any insights that could be helpful for someone developing interfaces to better convey what privacy controls do?
Yeah. So from my own inferences or from my own learnings is that having these controls in place first increases trust in your system or whatever system you're designing for, you're developing for. So first of all, let's have that as the basic starting point. And then now the question becomes, how do you make them accessible? How do you make them understandable? And how do you make sure that actually people use them appropriately or the way they're supposed to be used? And so one is through education, and one way you could educate is through suggestions or through tutorials of one way or another. Another way that we're exploring is, just guiding people to where to find these controls, and maybe a highlight could suffice or something better. Another thing that we just talked about is automatically taking action on behalf of the user. And so these are methods that, or these are decision aid methods that we're kind of used today. There's nothing new in a suggestion. I think you have seen multiple suggestions, either informing you or nudging you to take some form of action one way or another. And so we're trying to understand, when it comes to privacy, how do we actually better or empower users to use these controls, but also to make good decisions based on some of these decision aids that you have in place, so that you put you design for in your system.
And I'm curious if you'll share a little bit about yourself personally. How do you manage your privacy life? Are you someone that is always in incognito mode and clearing caches and things like that? Or what's the right level of, I don't know, data cleanliness and hygiene that you apply?
That's a good question. So the more I learned, initially when I began, I wasn't a privacy freak. But of course, the more as I indulged with the literature and learned and did some of my own research, then the more cautious I began. Yeah, so I do clear my cookies. I do take keen interest in what applications and what data these applications are asking for. I do set my privacy settings to the most privacy default that I could possibly get. And basically, try to make sure that I am cautious of what I'm sharing online or what image I'm projecting online. And I also use plugins that, help automatically block ads or automatically block cookies. So not to freak everybody out, but that's just my way of securing my privacy online and making sure that I'm comfortable doing what I need to do online.
I'm also curious to get your thoughts on how much of a threat you think people face from a lot of these like third-party bundled in services. I could be an app developer who has every best intention for the user and their privacy. And even though I'm collecting a little data that's maybe sensitive, I'm doing it in a smart, anonymized way. But then I just want some extra feature, some tracking service or analytics or whatever. So I bundle in this little one line of code. And unbeknownst to me, now all my user data is passing through someone else's server. These are real threats, right?
There's two ways I come to that. And since I did computer science, I know what it means to be a developer. And I know the mindset that developers have when it comes to developing these applications. And to be honest, I think user privacy in this case is usually the last thing that we think about. Yet it should be the first thing, because then that increases the chances of our technology is actually being used. And so, first of all, when it comes to applying third parties in applications, the reason that developers do that is you don't want to always build things from scratch. We have APIs that help us have already some complex algorithms in place that have already kind of addressed the problem that we're trying to address. So it's not always advisable to kind of spin or start from scratch all the time. But then I think the question should be, developers don't tend to actually devote the time to understand what data that the API they're including within their application. They don't take the time to learn of the privacy policies around that, what data is accessed and how it's logged and how that might affect their end users of their product, right? As would be expected, it's always a surprise to the users when they find out that actually what the application they were interacting with ended up passing on their data to a third-party application that they had no idea about, that they definitely, in their right sense of mind, wouldn't want for their access to. So I think, just like the gatekeeper question or iStore question that you asked me, I think it's up to the onus is on the developer to make sure they're developing an application with privacy in mind.
And for a developer like that, as you said, it's sort of not the priority. The first thing a developer does when something, has a permission error is usually set all the permissions public just to get the code working. That's the wrong attitude. But, is there a central place, a tenant, Hippocratic Oath, anything like that you can point people to that might give them a jump start on a better sort of design philosophy?
And there's a lot of literature that has been written in terms of how to do what they term as privacy by default, I think. And so that's the number one place I would point people to basically read. How can you design technologies, or how can you develop applications with privacy in mind? And how do you securely and privately do that? The other thing I also tend to think about or tend to advise people is there could be well vetted or well-known technologies that people trust already, and so wouldn't be surprised if they had their data. The only problem comes to nefariously or sneakily, using people's data and passing it on to third-party applications and using it in a way that is manipulative, they have no idea about. And if it were known to them before that action happening, they would definitely never consent to it. So I think those are the things one wants to keep in mind when actually going about their development.
I think overall technology has gotten better in this regard. Maybe not better enough or maybe not fast enough or whatever, but like my phone recently updated and now my settings have improved. I can say like certain apps can only do things if they're running. I have more control over background processing. Great. I mean, we could argue it's late to the game or not, but I think that's progress. What else are you hoping we see enters the general technology landscape? Are there other features like that you hope become more ubiquitous?
Yes, I like the granular level of controls are now being pushed out, and I like the what they call the nutrition labels that Apple recently put out with their latest update to iOS. Those are both educational and those are both ways in which we improve user privacy literacy or make people more aware or bring some form of transparency in terms of what these technologies are doing and what user data they are collecting. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is that increasingly, as technology gets better, there are going to be different forms or ways in which collected from users, whether unknowingly or knowingly, right? And so I think having these granular controls, one, is an advantage. It helps us know what data is being collected and how we can take action if we're not comfortable with that collection. The other thing that I want to address is also we see a lot of people do the privacy talk, I call it, but it is what is known as the privacy paradox, whereby people say they do care about their privacy, but they actually don't take the action to protect their privacy. And so I think the more of us who care about the privacy and take the steps to take action to actually put those protections in place, then the more we put the developers of these technologies on notice that we actually expect or we demand of privacy protections within applications that you're developing. Not only privacy protections, but also secure development of these applications. And so the more of us take action in those mundane ways, I think the more the message gets louder. And hopefully, who knows, then you finally end up with a privacy regulation on the table for people, especially within the US.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Moses, where can people best follow you online?
So the quickest way to find me would be on my Twitter account, which is Namzo098. So that's NAMZO with a 098. The other is I usually give my updates on there. The other is similarly Facebook name. My name's Moses Namara. I also have a website. If you Google my name, you should easily be able to find that. I usually update in terms of any new papers or any new research that I might be working on or have been able to publish.
Excellent. Well, I'll have links to all that in the show notes so people can follow up. Moses, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle.
Thanks for listening to Data Skeptic Interpretability. Our guest this week was Moses Namara. Give him a follow on Twitter at Namzo098. Our theme song is Number 5 by Big D and the Kids Table. Claudia Armbruster is our associate producer. Vanessa Burciaga does guest coordination. Kyle Polich is your host. Stay safe, everybody.